Imagine, friends, if India had never been colonized by Britishers. Today I am going to talk about colonialism, how Britishers come to India and how they colonized India. First, you have to know what is colonialism. Colonialism refers to the practice of a country or nation-state extending its control over other regions or territories outside its borders, often with the goal of exploiting resources, establishing settlements, and exercising political or economic dominance over the colonized population. Colonialism often involves the imposition of cultural, economic, and political systems on the colonized population, and can result in the displacement or subjugation of indigenous peoples, as well as the suppression of local cultures and traditions. In many cases, colonialism has been associated with the exploitation and abuse of indigenous populations, including forced labor, enslavement, and the destruction of local economies. Colonialism has been a major force shaping the modern world, with many of the economic, political, and social inequalities that exist today having their roots in the colonial era. Despite the fact that many former colonies have achieved independence, the legacy of colonialism continues to impact societies and cultures around the world. The British began their colonial enterprise in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, during the era of European exploration and expansion. The first English colony in North America was established in 1607 at Jamestown, Virginia, followed by the founding of the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts in 1620. The British colonial empire grew rapidly during the 18th and 19th centuries, as the British government and private companies established colonies in India, Africa, the Caribbean, and other regions of the world. The British East India Company, which was granted a monopoly on trade with India by the British government in 1600, became a powerful force in India, eventually controlling large portions of the Indian subcontinent. British colonialism was driven by a variety of factors, including the desire for wealth and resources, the spread of Christianity and Western culture, and the belief in the superiority of European civilization. British colonial rule often involved the exploitation and subjugation of indigenous populations, and in many cases resulted in the displacement of local cultures and traditions. Despite the negative impacts of British colonialism, it also left a lasting legacy of language, culture, and institutions in many of the countries it colonized. Many former British colonies continue to use English as a primary language, and British institutions such as parliamentary democracy and the rule of law have been adopted in many parts of the world. The British first arrived in India in the early 1600s, when the East India Company was granted a royal charter to trade with India. Initially, the British were primarily interested in trade, and established trading posts in major Indian ports such as Surat, Madras, and Calcutta. Over time, however, the East India Company became more involved in Indian politics and society, eventually acquiring political and military control over large portions of India. The company's control over India was formalized in 1858, when the British government took direct control over India following the Indian Rebellion of 1857. British colonial rule in India was characterized by a number of policies and practices aimed at consolidating British power and promoting British interests. These included the imposition of British law, language, and culture, the exploitation of India's resources and labor, and the suppression of Indian traditions and culture. One of the most controversial aspects of British colonialism in India was the implementation of the divide and rule strategy, which involved pitting different groups in India against each other in order to maintain British control. This strategy led to the exacerbation of existing ethnic and religious tensions in India, and contributed to the partition of India in 1947, when India was divided into two countries, India and Pakistan. Under British rule, people in India faced a number of significant challenges and problems. Some of the key issues included exploitation and economic deprivation. The British pursued policies aimed at exploiting India's resources and labor for their own benefit, leading to economic deprivation for many Indians. They imposed high taxes on Indian farmers and forced them to grow cash crops, which led to widespread poverty and famine. Political oppression. The British implemented policies aimed at suppressing Indian political activity and undermining Indian autonomy. Indian leaders who advocated for Indian independence or political rights were often imprisoned or exiled. Social and cultural suppression. The British also sought to suppress Indian culture and traditions, including religion, language, and customs. Indian cultural practices were often seen as inferior by the British, leading to a loss of cultural identity and self-esteem among many Indians. Partition and communal violence. The British divide and rule strategy created divisions between different religious and ethnic groups in India, leading to communal violence and eventually the partition of India in 1947, which led to widespread displacement and loss of life. Discrimination and racism. British colonial rule was characterized by discrimination and racism against Indians. British officials often held racist attitudes towards Indians and implemented policies that favored British interests over Indian interests. These problems had long-lasting impacts on Indian society and politics, and many of the issues faced by Indians under British rule continue to be relevant today. Despite the negative impacts of British colonialism in India, however, Indian society and culture have also been shaped by resistance to British rule and the struggle for independence. Without British colonialism, India may have developed its own unique political, economic, and social systems, rather than having these imposed by British rule. Indian culture and traditions may have also evolved in different ways, without the influence of British cultural norms and values. It is possible that India may have also avoided many of the negative impacts of British colonialism, such as economic exploitation, political oppression, and cultural suppression. However, it is also possible that India may have faced other challenges and problems in the absence of colonialism, such as internal conflicts or external pressures from neighboring regions. One thing that is clear, however, is that the struggle for Indian independence and the movement for Indian self-determination were critical in shaping Indian history and culture. If India had never been colonized, it is likely that these movements would not have emerged in the same way, and Indian society and politics may have developed along different trajectories. Without British colonialism, India may have been able to develop its own political, economic, and social systems based on its own unique cultural and historical context. Prior to British rule, India had a rich history of diverse political and social systems, ranging from small kingdoms to large empire, and a vibrant economy that was driven by trade and agriculture. It is possible that India may have continued to develop and refine these systems, building on its own strengths and addressing its own challenges, rather than having to adapt to the British system that was imposed upon it. In terms of economics, India had a thriving economy prior to British colonialism, with a sophisticated system of trade and commerce. Without British rule, India may have been able to continue to develop and modernize its economy, without being subject to British economic exploitation and forced restructuring. It is possible that India may have developed its own unique economic model, based on its own strengths and resources. Politically, India may have developed a different system of government, based on its own cultural and historical traditions. Prior to British rule, India had a rich tradition of governance, with diverse systems of governance ranging from small local councils to large empire. Without British colonialism, India may have been able to develop a unique system of governance that was more closely aligned with its own cultural and historical traditions. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like.